Maybe I should have called this one Zack Snyder Cultists Demand Rebel Moon Theatrical Release, but overly hostile video titles give me a stomach ache.
With your gift and your talent and your vision, are you kidding?
Hi, I'm LadyJenevia. I have returned to once again talk about Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon. The last time I talked about this, the trailer had just dropped and I had come home really late that night and I went into my closet to quietly speak into my microphone to try to record some thoughts because I didn't want the sound to travel to bother people. That video was made in a rush, but this time I'm making this video in early September in order to publish it in late September because I'm trying out this new thing where I get ahead of what I want to publish on here. If it is a model that has worked for network television for decades, why shouldn't it work for me? There's a term that gets thrown around on social media, YouTube film bro channels, and maybe the odd print piece here and there. Zack Snyder cultists. To the best of my knowledge, I don't think I've ever been called that directly, not that I'm aware of anyway, and not that I recall. Not to mention, if you were to try to form a judgment of me based solely on my YouTube channel, I tend to float from one interest to another as opposed to focusing only on Zack Snyder's filmography. I'm usually someone who will make one video about Zack and then I will disappear from the topic for a month or a few months before I circle back around to it. But I am aware of the term. It's something that gets thrown around as a derogatory description for Zack Snyder fans, and in particular, the ones who are most expressive and vocal about that interest on social media, specifically.
The internet is all about illusions, girl. You know that.
I do know that.
Invoking the word cult in any form and all of the associations and scary instances of actual real-life cults, it's not particularly flattering, but the term is clearly meant to be hyperbolic, as is often the case with social media slang. Even if anyone were to refer to me with that term, I doubt it would bother me all that much, because it's very clearly not an accurate description. There isn't a single celebrity I can think of whom I agree 100% with or unquestioningly follow. I'll question everyone. I don't know these people like that. But I bring this term up to poke fun at how there was a recent quote from Zack Snyder, the likes of which drew so much ire, specifically from his fans. And I found the situation to be hilarious, specifically because of this stereotype that people have of Zack Snyder's fans, that they're really intense and diehard and even hyperbolically being compared to a cult. Zack Snyder said something that had a whole lot of his fans turning into Keke Palmer. I don't know who this man is. So what happened?
Do people just fawn over you?
The first Rebel Moon trailer was released, as we are all aware by this point, and with it came the first wave of promotional interview clips on video and published in print. Among that first wave was an interview with Polygon, in which the following paragraph was published. The need for original streaming content led to the release of his definitive Justice League. Now, he isn't wholly invested in the traditional cinematic experience for Rebel Moon. With this, I was not super interested in a theatrical release, especially with the PG-13 versus extended cuts, Snyder said. I feel like with the theatrical release, the way the model is, it takes some energy out of it. When I tell you, the fandom had a bit of a meltdown. I don't know if I recall anything quite like this happening where the most emotionally responsive part of Zack's fandom on social media lashed out at something Zack himself had said. Normally, this type of energy is reserved for people who willfully misunderstand Zack Snyder's works or say something really heinous about his personal character, or even worse than that, they bring members of his family into the equation. But this time, people were upset at Zack for this quote for a couple of reasons. The general state of the film industry is, to put it mildly, total disarray. You've got SAG and WGA on strike at the same time. Donation links are in the pinned comment, the same as every video I am publishing during the strike. 2023 alone has had an onslaught of overly expensive IP blockbusters, the majority of which have at best fizzled and at worst cataclysmically crashed at the box office. The bubble has burst. The mega corporations are out of control, and one of the ingredients of this disgusting buffet we are all being forced to eat at is that the FTC has been completely negligent in breaking up these larger corporate monopolies in general, but especially for Hollywood, since that's the topic we're focusing on in this video. A lot of Zack's fans want to see Rebel Moon on the big screen. You watch the trailer, and it has the look of a big space fantasy epic. It ignites the senses in this really classic way. If you put aside the general propensity for performative emotions in trailer reactions, I do think there is an element of genuine excitement for Rebel Moon that reaches beyond the core fan base of Zack Snyder. Zack is really great at serving a visual spectacle, which lends itself very well to the big screen experience. But I would like to unpack some of the facets of this topic as it applies to Zack Snyder, Rebel Moon, but also a broader scope of ongoing issues in show business. I'm going to assume that a lot of the people who will watch this video are already fans of Zack Snyder, but for those uninitiated, to make a long story short, Zack Snyder is a director who has had to deal with a tremendous amount of studio meddling in his previous feature films. I don't say that as if he's some anomaly in that regard. Any working director in Hollywood, especially one who has worked on as many projects from a big IP as Zack Snyder has, is unfortunately bound to deal with this type of treatment. Too many cooks in the kitchen, someone's going to end up injured. The follow-up paragraph in that Polygon interview reads, "Both parts of Rebel Moon are getting R-rated extended cuts, which will be more than 30 minutes longer than the films. But he didn't have to fight anyone to get those cuts made. My big fans would say, why are they with you? Just do the extended cuts," he laughed. In the initial conversations with Netflix, they made it a part of the plan. Zack Snyder had to deal with a lot of meddling on his DC films, but this was also something he dealt with on a project like Sucker Punch. It was a situation involving extreme misogyny. I talked about this in my Women of Zack Snyder's Filmography video essay. It was to do with the MPA, or at that point, I think they were still being called the MPAA, and the fact that they're just the Hays Code under a different name. I've said that before, and I will probably say it again. You can watch that video, though, if you want more information about what the Sucker Punch situation was. So Zack Snyder and Deborah Snyder, who is both his wife and producer, they are not strangers to the struggles that come with the theatrical release as it intertwines with making films for major studios who have to deal with going through the MPA process, among other things. I am not in any way confused or surprised by the fact that Zack Snyder is cheerleading his working relationship with Netflix. They are giving him carte blanche, while the old school studios have time and time again failed to do so, even though Zack Snyder has more than proven his worth as an auteur whose storytelling is fascinating in the way that it toes the line between populism for a general audience that enjoys a visual spectacle of an action-packed blockbuster, and the high concept art for film fans who want to do deep dives into analyzing the socio-political themes and heavy use of feminism in his stories. It's an easy choice for a team like Zack and Deborah Snyder to go wherever they are receiving the financing and the freedom to create the projects they've been wanting to put forth for, at this point, decades. There are quotes floating around of Zack saying that his vision for Rebel Moon has been percolating for something like 20 years, if I'm remembering that correctly. But this brings us to an interesting point regarding Netflix and big-name filmmakers.
That's all you take? You just waste the rest?
Over the years of Netflix developing itself as a source of original films and series, the platform has developed a pattern of signing expensive deals to book large-name talent for their platform. This is something they've done with famous stand-up comedians, but also for established names in the pool of Hollywood filmmakers. My first recollections of this were for Baz Luhrmann with The Get Down and the Wachowskis, who co-created Sense8 with J. Michael Straczynski. To this day, Sense8 remains one of, if not my all-time favorite Netflix originals. The Wachowskis, of course, are best known for their work on the Matrix films, but they also have a number of other well-known films with passionate fan followings. Bound, V for Vendetta, and yes, Jupiter Ascending. I remember in the early days of Netflix, the platform was struggling to be regarded with the same legitimacy as traditional studios. The iconic Steven Spielberg was pushing to keep films made specifically for Netflix from being eligible for Academy Award nominations. Spielberg had gone so far as to say, "I don't believe films that are just given token qualifications in a couple of theaters for less than a week should qualify for the Academy Award nomination." Funnily enough, we fast forward several years from that quote to 2021, and Steven Spielberg's production company, Amblin, struck a deal to make original films for Netflix, though I personally have yet to see any Steven Spielberg Netflix films. West Side Story 2021 and The Fabelmans were both theatrical releases, but Spielberg is a producer on Maestro. Maestro will be released on Netflix, so perhaps that's under the umbrella of this deal. Furthermore, other prominent filmmakers to create films released on Netflix include Guillermo del Toro with Pinocchio, Martin Scorsese with The Irishman, David Fincher with Mank, and of course, Alfonso Cuarón with Roma, which was nominated for 10 Academy Awards and won 3. That's not a comprehensive list of prominent filmmakers who have visited Netflix to release at least one film, but there is definitely this recurring tendency for Netflix to facilitate creative freedom for established auteurs. Off the top of my head, I know that Martin Scorsese and Guillermo del Toro struggled for many years to be able to get those films made, despite both of them being as established as they are in the industry. And of course, Zack Snyder, I've already mentioned, has had to deal with a number of issues with traditional studios and meddling. It's great that these people have been able to have a satisfying work experience where they're finally able to make these passion projects of theirs, but it's important to make the distinction that Netflix is only accommodating to these people who have built up their names in the traditional film studio or network television model. Another prominent name that needs to be mentioned in this discussion, a large established name whom Netflix courted with a big expensive deal, is Shonda Rhimes. Though Shonda is not a large name as a director of feature films, she built up her name as a juggernaut of network television. Beginning with Grey's Anatomy and then Scandal and finally How to Get Away with Murder, those 3 shows would come to be a cultural fixture. Thursday nights on ABC, that was Shonda's time. 8 p.m., 9 p.m., 10 p.m., those 3 shows would air back to back and millions of people would tune in, even as the market was on the cusp of change, the likes of which had never been seen before. The further escalation and domination of streaming, which would of course lead to the bubble bursting the way that it currently has, with both SAG and WGA now being on strike together at the same time, this being a joint strike for the first time in 60 years. All of those names, though, whether their main point of working is in feature films or network television, what they have in common is that they built their names in legacy studios, legacy companies, and a legacy system that, despite having its fair share of flaws, has still allowed for and even facilitated the growth and development of storytellers to become the big names we know them as today. The Shonda Rhimes situation was wild because that woman made ABC so much money, more money than I have ever seen in my life. And then she tried to get a Disneyland pass for a friend or a family member, but anyway, they gave her the runaround about getting this Disneyland pass. And mind you, this is something that this corporation is apparently more than happy to do for any number of VIPs in show business, but they didn't show her the respect she deserved, the respect that she had more than earned for over a decade of prominent television success for their network, the likes of which other networks would have, I'm sure, loved to have been achieving at this point in time. So she had enough. She got her Netflix deal and went on her merry way, and now Bridgerton is one of the biggest shows on Netflix worldwide.
I have a thing about feminine rage.
My regular viewers know I've covered that show quite a bit. My next video, I believe, will be about that show, but we will get to that. But again, Netflix has completely failed to nurture their talent. They're all business. It's the Silicon Valley-fication of the filmmaking industry. All they do is obsess over crunching numbers, cutting corners to such an extent that Korean actors are not paid any residuals for their work on Netflix. I wouldn't put it past Korean actors to go on strike against Netflix next. And to be quite honest, I hope they do, because they've made Netflix far too much money to not be getting their fair share of those profits. But as for Hollywood specifically, all of these big names that Netflix has courted, they've only been able to thrive because the traditional show business of Hollywood has always had room and made room to reward a few, perhaps not enough, but a few artists who demonstrate their skills, who have success with the works they've been able to make. The old bosses of Hollywood, despite their flaws, at least knew well enough to reward a lot of filmmakers who showed promise, people who gave the studios a hit. Netflix, however, has not built up a single name in that way, and therein lies a fundamental flaw of their business model. They do not understand their product, and they don't understand the movie audience. Jaws was not a hit because some algorithms decided which combination of genres or actors or other categorizing descriptors would mathematically combine to yield a profit. Star Wars did not become a universally known staple of pop culture because the studio knew every correct business decision to maximize their profits. And we all know that George Lucas made a fortune because he retained rights to things like the licensing and merchandising, which I'm sure would have been considered not the smartest business decision on the studio's part. And I have no problem with that situation unfolding the way that it did, because George Lucas more than earned all of that money. Those films were successful because they were made by storytellers with a very specific point of view that resonated with the audience. Storytellers who were given the room to collaborate with the other masters of craft in any other numbers of departments. Make your tiny models, work the rigs to make your silly looking shark open and shut its mouth. Is there room for these different types of companies to learn a select few things from each other for the better? Sure. Netflix and other streaming first companies have a hell of a lot to learn about fostering the development and nurturing of artists. They have demonstrated time and time again that they are short-sighted, even more profit-driven than the old school studios, which is something I did not even know was possible. You can have the dual contradictory opinion that Netflix is good for letting these brilliant storytellers, including but not limited to Zack Snyder, make their passion projects, and that they're bad for any number of the ethically questionable things that have come to light about their business practices, especially with all of these stories to do with the strikes. Also, on this larger artistic existential dimension of them failing to build up a new generation of storytellers and prioritizing a quantity over quality model of greenlighting far too many projects for any of them to stand a chance of being decent, let alone being able to get their moment in the spotlight. The easiest example I can use for this, as it applies to Netflix, is their original rom-coms. I haven't seen all of them, of course, because like I said, they use a quantity over quality method, so there's far too many to be able to keep up with all of them. And also, so many of them are not good. I don't want to watch all of them. I've already seen far more than I would ever recommend anyone watch, and that's partially because of research I was doing for a project I may or may not do on my channel, but I won't elaborate on that. Of the dozens of Netflix rom-coms I've seen, I can name one, or if I'm feeling charitable, two of their rom-coms that are at minimum good. That's a nightmare ratio. That's me being trapped in a horror film where I don't get to be the final girl. The other issue, which I've briefly touched on in a general sense, but also as it pertains to Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon, is the issue of Netflix's minimal or all too rare instances of theatrical releases for their originals. They also, for the most part, don't do physical releases. There once was a time where folks might not have objected to these things as much. When Netflix was first created, they were selling the audience the promise of convenience. You don't have to pay for expensive tickets to see films at the cinema. You can watch anything you'd like from the comfort of your own home if you just pay for a Netflix subscription. You get the DVDs sent to you. You get to keep them for as long as you'd like. There will be no late fees. That evolves to you can stream whatever movies you would like to watch. We will have what you need. We have so many things. A beautiful lie. But capitalism is as capitalism does, so every other mega corporation decided they wanted to copy this model as soon as they saw it becoming profitable for someone else. And these corporations have now escalated every facet of how they run these streaming platforms in the worst ways possible. Everything is about quantity over quality. Just keep spamming the audience with new releases. Cancel everything before it's had any time to find an audience. And perhaps worst of all, remove streaming originals from your platforms for tax write-offs. Theatrical releases are essential because they are an event. It's the optimum experience for how to watch a film, and I really do believe that. I think it's very easy for someone like Zack Snyder, who lives in a mansion, who has a giant home theater, to think it's perfectly fine to not prioritize pushing for a theatrical release, because what he gets in exchange for that is the creative control he's been so callously deprived of for so many years of his career. That doesn't change the fact that many of the common folk either don't own a television, or maybe their television isn't all that fancy, or they don't own the most supreme sound systems. Those things are expensive. A cinema can have technical malfunctions, sure, but for the most part, it's a much better option to really see a story like Rebel Moon in the best form possible at the cinema. And I also believe that launching a film at the cinema is the best way to set a film up for success. Now, sure, not every film finds its audience during its initial theatrical release, but I don't think that's applicable for something like Rebel Moon. You've already got this dedicated fan base for Zack Snyder as a filmmaker. You've got an entire year of over-expensive IP blockbusters flopping financially. So the audience has spoken and they want something fresh and new and original. And I cannot stress enough how physical media needs to also be made a priority. The audience, film fans, Zack Snyder fans, whomever, need to push for this, because even though I don't believe that Rebel Moon will struggle to find a large audience, the principle of the matter is that none of these streaming originals are safe. These corporations have told all of us exactly who they are, time and time again, and at this point, it's now our collective responsibility to listen to that and push for solutions to fix the problems that they created, because they sure as hell are not going to be the ones to fix it. I don't believe that Rebel Moon is in danger of being deplatformed from Netflix, but again, this is not about Rebel Moon on its own. It's about the principle. I have no interest in giving Disney Plus money for the rest of my life to have access to Netflix shows that ended up there because of licensing issues. For as many comparisons have been made to Star Wars in the online discussions of how Rebel Moon is or is not similar to Star Wars, I think these mega corporations have conveniently forgotten that Star Wars could not have the legacy it has today if physical media didn't exist. I was not alive when the original trilogy came out. I first got into Star Wars by watching VHS tapes of the original trilogy. They were rented from a video store, and I watched them at my Obachan and Ojichan's house back home in my motherland. And then, of course, the prequel trilogy came out, but that's neither here nor there. This is not a Star Wars video. People also cannot afford to pay for this many streaming platforms. The market has shifted again. I would absolutely gift someone a streaming release on physical media if I felt it was something well suited to their preferences, their tastes in genres or types of stories. To try to put a bow on a situation and set of circumstances that is by no means resolved or even close to being resolved, I want Rebel Moon to be released in cinemas and on physical media. But beyond that, a cinematic release and physical media needs to be the standard for all streaming originals on all streaming platforms. I'm vaguely aware of the fact that Netflix specifically has done limited theatrical releases for some of their originals, particularly the more serious dramas that are hoping to be able to submit themselves for award show nominations. They have to be in the cinemas for some small amount of time at minimum to be eligible. And to quote one of my childhood crushes, that's not good enough.
That's not good enough!
I more or less never see Netflix releases in cinemas. And the reason for that is that I more or less never see them playing there. I know that Zack Snyder's previous Netflix release, Army of the Dead, had some sort of limited theatrical release. Guess what? I never saw it in a cinema. It was not listed at my local spots that I would have considered visiting in order to see it. The only time I have ever seen a Netflix release at a cinema was Glass Onion. I vaguely remember stories making their rounds grounds that cinemas wanted to have it in cinemas for longer than the 1 week run that it had. But if I'm not mistaken, Netflix was the one that said no, but don't quote me on that as if it's an ironclad fact, because memory can be warped over time and I don't entirely remember where I heard that from. But I do know that it only played for a week because I, in all my overly intense adoration of Rian Johnson whodunits, saw Glass Onion 6 times in its 1 week release. I'm not surprised by the idea of cinemas wanting to have Glass Onion for longer than 1 week, by the way, because my main local spot that I go to watch films had Knives Out playing for something like 4 months, which is fairly unheard of as a theatrical run for a film that is not part of some mega franchise, at least not in today's market. I don't know what or how Glass Onion got the deal it had, but Rian Johnson is by no means the only well-established filmmaker to land a large deal with Netflix, so I'm going to need a whole lot more of the big-name filmmakers to start insisting that a wide theatrical Glass Onion-esque release also be written into their contracts. And if you don't know how to make these tech bros submit to you, just call up James Cameron. I'm sure he would be more than happy to coach you on the art of that specifically. And hopefully the bigger names making that more normalized could help to snowball that so it can become standard for even more filmmakers who are making things for Netflix as a platform. And the same goes for physical releases. Push for bonus features to make a return as well, and commentary tracks on the DVDs, because I'm so tired of those being all but gone entirely from today's cycle of production, distribution, and release. The short-sighted business mindset of these tech companies, because that's what streaming platforms are, will cause another wave of art to be lost historically if viewers and artists with power don't act accordingly. And I am not saying any of that to be hyperbolic. I've mentioned before on my channel how many of the first films are now lost media, but when I really reflect on that topic further, that is not the only period of time when art has been lost. There are episodes of Doctor Who that are lost. There are many TV films or series or specials that are increasingly difficult to find the more that time passes, because honestly, these large companies being bad at archiving their own works of art is a tale as old as the history of filmmaking itself. One other random example, Ben Affleck's Air, that had a theatrical release before it eventually opened fully on Prime Video. Even if you have a film that will predominantly have its home be on a streaming platform, there is no reason not to put the film out in cinemas first. But still, also release them on physical media. I know this video is so much bigger and broader than just talking about Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon or even Netflix itself as just one company, but I saw some of the tweets and the general push with new hashtag campaigns being created by Zack Snyder fans who want the film to be released in cinemas, and that ultimately got my mental wheels spinning, and it kind of exploded into me wanting to air out a lot of the issues I have with the general state of the broader film and television industry, and in particular streaming companies. Hopefully it was coherent enough for your liking, but I will admit I'm dealing with a bit of a time crunch for reasons that will become apparent soon. Thank you all for watching. Thank you to my patrons, and I will be back in another video in a bit. Bye.